Hello, good morning. Maybe I can invite Ambassador João Pereira to sit here, and also Cynthia Alcide. Thank you. So I'm very proud of FGV Europe partnership with CEPS, I think allowed the organization of this very timely seminar for the second year. This year we had the strategic collaboration of FGV Rio Law School, which brought its unique knowledge and valuable speakers to our seminar. We are very honored to count with your support. Thank you. FGV Europe is keen on promoting seminars such as this one that include central topics of our activities. Today, we will attempt to explore the EU and Brazil partnership for the green energy transition and the opportunities for trade and investment in net zero projects. The partnership between the European Union and Brazil is strategically imperative and more important than ever, especially in the green energy transition. Brazil represents an essential trade and investment partner for the EU and the world in the green energy transition. It's a major player on clean energy innovation, accounting for almost 7% of the planet's renewable energy production. The EU and Brazil's second largest trade partner, the EU is Brazil's second largest trading partner, and also one of the most relevant foreign investors in many sectors in Brazilian economy, including clean techs. To discuss all these matters, we have gathered a very rich group of experts who will bring their unique perspective to the debate. Especially, I would like to thank the participation in the opening keynote of President Carlos Ivan, who will give us a brief overview of EU and Brazil geopolitics and energy transition. Moreover, I would like to thank Ambassador João Mendes Pereira, the Brazilian ambassador in Belgium and Luxembourg, for his opening words. Ambassador Pedro Miguel da Costa Silva, Brazilian ambassador of Brazil to the EU, who will speak on the second panel. Or our dear colleagues from FGV Rio Law, Vice Dean Antonio Maristelo Porto and Professor Romulo Sampaio. Our guest and speaker, Joaquim Levy, President of the Board of Banco Safra and former Brazilian Finance Minister. Paulo Macedo, Global Director, International Relations, Policy and Advocacy, Heightened. Henrique Galan, Senior Law Officer responsible for Brazil AIB, and Stefano Soro, Head of Unit Net Zero Industries, Sustainable and Circular Products, European Commission. Our dear colleagues from CEPS, once again, thank you for the opportunity, especially Cynthia Alcide, Mallory Charles, and Carol Lanu. I wish you very productive discussion throughout this afternoon, and I hope you are able to foster valuable learning opportunities. Enjoy the seminar. Thank you. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. At the outset, I would like to thank FGV Europe and the Center for European Policies Studies for the kind invitation to participate in this forum. Mr. Carlos Ivan Simonsen Leal, Mr. Cesar Cunha Campos, and Ms. Cynthia Alcide, congratulations on the organization of this event. I also take this opportunity to greet all participants and panelists, especially Minister Joaquim Levy, both here in person and those participating remotely. It is also a pleasure to meet fellow Ambassador Pedro Miguel da Costa Silva, lifelong friend and outstanding colleague. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. The ongoing quest to decarbonize economies and to transition to clean forms of energy is one of the most pressing issues all countries are facing today. In Brazil, this is not a project for the future. This is what we already practice. Brazil has one of the cleanest energy mixes in the world. The country set a new record for clean energy generation in 2023, with 93.1% of all electricity generated coming from renewable sources. The transport sector has been using biofuels for more than 4 decades, ethanol and biodiesel programs. The northeast of the country has excellent conditions for producing green hydrogen, thanks to geographic factors such as abundance of winds and incident of sunlight. Of course, we face challenges in order to save energy or to be more efficient, particularly in the transportation sector as well as in the manufacturing sector. We see infrastructure development as a tool to achieve this goal, together with more investment, both private and public, in research and development. As a consequence, the country offers ample investment opportunities. Brazil has a significant and growing internal market, and as many of you are aware, is also an important export player in several areas. My friends, I would like to dedicate a few words about the bilateral relations between Brazil and Belgium. Our country have established relations almost 2 centuries ago, shortly after becoming independent countries. We share a rich history of cooperation in many areas. Bilateral trade between Brazil and Belgium is around $6.5 billion a year. Brazil is the main trade and investment partner of Belgium in the Latin American region. Brazilian companies have a significant portfolio of investments in Belgium in areas ranging from food to machinery. Belgium was, in 2023, the sixth largest European market for our exports. Belgium was also the fifth largest European exporter to Brazil last year, and is also a prominent investor in Brazil. According to the Brazilian Central Bank, Belgium is the third largest investor from the European Union in Brazil and the sixth largest overall, according to the criterion of final controller. With those trade figures as a backdrop, I'm convinced that our countries should aim at an increased level of strategic cooperation, which would help us reduce excessive dependence on a few markets. We may recall that at the beginning of the pandemic, most countries needed to buy surgical masks and medical equipment from abroad, sometimes depending on very few suppliers. Recently, the Belgian presidency of the Council of the EU held a conference on trade policy and critical raw materials. Part of the discussion highlighted the importance of strengthening commercial ties and how to research and development are crucial to the development of greener economy. The diversification of our economic activities as well as of our export and import ties is therefore of mutual interest. Our economies are complementary. Brazil is a major producer of energy, minerals, and food, and Belgium has excellent companies in the areas of biomedicine, biotechnology, and aerospace sector. But we have also to think beyond the traditional model. For example, Brazil produces airplanes, and Belgium applies a great deal of innovative solutions in agriculture. We share common goals, such as the need to develop a stronger industrial sector, the need to diversify and de-risk supply chains, the need to increase market access. Belgium is preparing an important economic mission to Brazil in November. I believe this mission has the potential to increase and enhance trade and investment ties. Ladies and gentlemen, the discussion today will contribute to shed light on how to increase cooperation between Brazil and the EU in green transition and how to use trade as a tool to advance a low-emission economic model. Wish you all a good conference. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon also from my side. It is really a great pleasure to see you here. It's an honor for CEPS for the second year to host this important meeting, which is aiming at fostering the dialogue and to lead to a partnership, increased partnership between the EU and Brazil. So let me say a few words also to bring in a bit the European perspective and how actually things may be changing in the coming years. So I'm not saying nothing new if I say that the world and the EU is facing new challenges very big challenges. Some of them are really new. Of course, one is the green transition. This is not really new, but what has changed quite recently, it's really the fact that geopolitical tensions have escalated and the global landscape is really changing quite drastically. I mean, of course, the war in Ukraine has represented a big change in Europe, and this has led to put at the center stage security issues. This, of course, it's not only about Europe, is worldwide, but it's particularly sensitive in Europe. And this has also basically brought Europe, the EU, to put forward two key strategies. One is the Green Deal, which basically defines the pattern towards the green transition. This was already prepared and announced in 2019. This will be continued. But the second aspect, which is more novel, is this approach to de-risking. De-risking, securing supplies in certain strategic sectors, for instance, clean technologies, raw materials, but also mitigating critical dependencies. And this is, I think, what is really changing and what can mark a new approach for the European Union vis-à-vis international relations and the choice for its partners. And I think in this context that the partnership between EU and Brazil becomes strategic. It is clear that in the context of the EU Net Zero Industry Act and the EU Critical Raw Material Act, the European Union is not only pointing to a new way of producing where innovation and clean technology is clear, but is also pointing to a diversification of network of free trade agreements. I think they will become at the center stage. But also issues related to nearshoring or friendshoring. This is a big topic now in political circles in Brussels, and of course strategic international partnerships. So it is really against this backdrop that I think the meeting of today can really set the scene for constructive discussion, which can lead to very practical and concrete initiatives. So this was a bit the idea behind the design of the agenda of today. So first to look at EU-Brazil cooperation to explore mutual partnership and how they can act together multilaterally. And then the second session really focusing on specific investment opportunity in Brazil. And with this, I'm closing. I'm really confident that the discussion of today can really shed light on opportunities, and I'm very much looking forward to an engaging conversation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe I can invite. Yeah, I invite Carlos Ivan to do his lecture. Thank you.
Do I need this? Okay. First of all, I would like to salute all the people of CEPS in the name of Mrs. Alcide, and to salute our foreign relations in the name of our two ambassadors, Mendes Pereira and Costa Silva, here present, and all the people of FGV in the name of Mr. Cesar Cunha Campos. And all the others, if they don't belong to CEP as FGV or to our foreign office, I salute too, but I won't mention their names because it would be too long. I have been asked to speak about geopolitics and energy transition because that seems to be of uttermost interest to Europeans, and I think it should be. Europe has committed some strategic mistakes in the past, like switching off nuclear energy in Germany because of the Greens. Let me go straight to the point. And then over-dependency on Russia, on gas and oil, because it was cheap. And now it's paying the cost of these two actions. Were they avoidable? I don't know. Okay, sometimes going back and examining history after it has passed, it's a useless exercise. You only have to recognize that diversification is important when you deal with energy supply. I have tried to convince to start a project in African countries for them to produce ethanol so that ethanol would become a worldwide commodity. Brazil is the greatest producer of ethanol, but if you only have one producer, no one is going to adopt it except Brazil. The US uses a little bit of ethanol, but coming from corn. I understand that in Europe there are some experiments, and both are ethanol coming from corn, which is kind of inefficient when compared to the sugarcane ethanol. But market pressures didn't allow us to develop a market for ethanol producers in Africa, which at that time we thought it would be the best way to enter Europe with ethanol would be if Africans would produce it, because Europeans would feel safer because of that clout, economic clout in Africa. That has passed. The Chinese are now present in Africa, and they are undermining European positions, and ethanol is bound, at least for the moment, to remain a Brazilian very successful experiment, but I don't expect Europeans to risk, again, committing another mistake. Europeans, like anyone, learn with their own mistakes. So they want diversification, which is quite difficult right now. Why? Nuclear fuel, and it's very interesting, by the way, but nuclear now has become a renewable resource, which is it's really an exercise, a psychological exercise more than anything else. One day we'll say that here in Europe you'll start saying that nuclear is green, okay? Nuclear fuel is not produced everywhere. So there are no big mines of uranium or cobalt or some radioactive suitable material in Europe that I know, at least not in the European Union area, not enough. And there's a lot on Russia, on Kazakhstan, on China, on Africa. That all puts geopolitical risk. The main point is that either you have a navy that controls the 7 oceans, or you cannot risk depending on this type of energy. In Brazil, for the moment, for a long moment, for the next 20 years, we will be very safe from the point of energy production. What we have now in oil is enough for this period. It's not enough forever, but it's enough for this period. However, we have enormous reserves that have been discovered in what is called the equatorial band in the north side of Brazil. It extends from Rio Grande do Norte, the tip of Brazil on the east, to Guianas and Venezuela. But of course, those are fossil fuels. We also have discovered a lot of gas in Brazil, but a lot of gas in the interior of Brazil has to be brought to the cities, the big cities of Brazil, and it's probably enough for us. It's not enough to export. It implies, however, that Brazil will not be putting pressure on the total demand of gas in the world. We have enough sources of radioactive material, and we are constantly controlled by the nuclear agency. That's a delicate point because we have developed ways of purifying uranium that everyone wants to get for free after we invested on the research. Okay? And it's understandable that we don't agree with that. It's not a military issue. It's an economic issue. Brazil is gifted by wonderful weather, lots of water, and sun. And from that, you get a lot of sun power, you get a lot of wind power in certain regions of a country, and we may actually increase our productivity, our production of electricity. On the other hand, we may not expect a large growth from classical hydroelectric power because we have almost occupied all the possible sources. A hydroelectric dam is built to last 150 years. So those machines are going to be there producing for 100 years more at least. And we are not, if demand grows moderately, then we will have electric power. The problem is not that if demand grows modestly. The problem is if our economy accelerates. And we have another problem, which is as delicate as producing the energy, which is placing the energy after it has been produced on the place where it is to be consumed. And that is a completely different story because we have to face a restructuring of our internal distribution system, which is centered under a company that's not, if it's a public in the sense that it belongs to it's not a public in the American British sense. It doesn't have shares. It belongs to the government, called ONS, which is a distributor of energy. But that was designed for an integrated system of 50 years ago. It has to be renewed. And it changed physically. I'm talking about an engineering problem. And that immediately brings a conundrum. Are we going to think of Brazil in the coming reconsolidation of the energy producers as one entity, or are we going to consider Brazil in South America? Because obviously the design of this network of distribution is different in one situation or another. You cannot design it to be one thing and then say, I want to change my mind and simply drop that design and build something else. It's too expensive. That is very important. And that is a point where subtlety is necessary. This reconsolidation, which is already, it has already started in Brazil with the privatization of Eletrobras, the big holding company, former state-owned holding company of the electricity producers. The privatization of Eletrobras, the probable, very probable restructuring of CEMIG in Minas Gerais, and even the sale of CPFL to the Chinese has already started the game. But the game, amazingly enough, depends also on an interaction between Brazil and Europe. Why? Because 25, 30 years ago, mostly Spanish companies got cheap money from Germany for those indirect mechanisms that you have here that I don't judge. I simply see where the money comes from, where it goes. And they bought companies, utilities in South America. And some of them, with the changes of conditions in Europe, are, as we say, in dire straits. So we are very much afraid they start being sold to the Chinese. Okay? It's a challenge. So if we say, are we going to have a South American business or a Brazilian business only? It depends on the finances of certain European companies. Let me remind you that YPF was restatized some years ago in Argentina on a very clumsy way. And everyone shouted against the restatization of YPF. I was even there in Buenos Aires the day it happened. I was at the Casa Rosada when it happened. And I saw people arriving very happy because they were taking the company back. The only guys that were sad were the guys from the unions. Maybe they had good economists that were telling them, this is not the way to do. We are not going to get credibility enough in the future. So YPF was restatized, and obviously every European company in South America switched to get back cash mode. The difficulties of credit in Europe, plus the get back cash mode, meant less investment in South America, and therefore that created a pattern which is, for many countries, the nightmare of a regulator. You don't want to push for taking back the control of a company, but you need the company to invest. They are providers of a public service, and they are not doing it. They are simply taking all the cash flow, even the part that should be invested. You don't want to tell them that they should invest, but they should provide a certain level of service. You do that in Europe, we think the same way in South America, in Brazil especially. So there is a conundrum in the electricity market, which is integration or no integration, and how do we interact with this historical fact, which, from my point of view, is better if the Europeans remain and we just help them cross the bridge. Why is that so? Because we don't want to have the type of discussion that we have with Bolivia some years ago. Petrobras invested in gas lines to Bolivia, and then they were nationalized by Bolivia. There was this big discussion of a president of Bolivia then, Evo Morales, wanted to take control, charge any price. The result is that we started buying gas from the Persian Gulf, and we abandoned Bolivia, and now they want us to invest back in Bolivia, and like an European would do, we are thinking, okay? So it's the same story. It's a problem of investment and getting a return on your investment. So, Brazil can produce green energy, hydrogen, yes. There is to be examined there if we are not supporting subsidies indirectly. So, the price of a thing has to be the real price. The risks of a thing have to be shared, I wouldn't say equally, but proportionally to the benefit. And therefore, there is a huge discussion there. But this discussion of energy is just the supply side. You have the demand side. And on the demand side, you face one important discussion that affects European presence in all of South America, which is the option for electric vehicles or not. We already have ethanol vehicles that are quite affordable. Ethanol is now produced at zero balanced carbon. They don't need lithium batteries, so no rare material in there. We can sport our lithium. We can even make batteries and export them. And ethanol is quite clean. It's not good for airplanes, I agree, but not for big airplanes, but for small airplanes it functions. For small helicopters it functions. Some European industries are trying to push an European electrical vehicle solution in Brazil because they want to, and that's very natural, to average down the fixed cost of this innovation. However, we have Asian car industry there. And the Asians have not committed a mistake that is very common in Europe. Imagine how the European Union would be if Germany was 75% of Europe's GDP and 75% of its population. Where would the siege of the European Union be? In Brussels or in Berlin? Okay? So, the sheer difference of size of Brazil to its neighbors, and I'm not minimizing their importance, I'm just putting a fact, means that it was a mistake to divide European investments in car industry to produce luxury cars in Argentina and cheap, more popular cars in Brazil. The Asians are producing all the cars in Brazil. And of course, because of that, because sometimes Argentinians create barriers and so forth, although no barriers should exist in the Mercosur, then we are switching market share. So a mistake to identify the real demand for vehicles. Imagine, I came here from Cologne, 1 hour and a half by train. From here to Paris, I believe, is an hour and a half, 2 hours. And sometimes I take a plane in Rio to have a lunch with a governor of a state, like, for example, the state of Pernambuco. I fly almost 3 hours by plane. I have lunch and I come back. Okay, this is normal for us. And that's 1,500 kilometers or at least. So imagine putting in Brazil a network for distribution, electricity for cars. Isn't it much more efficient to adopt Toyota's solution, which is a car that has 2 engines. One is gasoline, the other one is electric, and the first one, when it's working, is charging the battery for the second one. Isn't this more adaptable to our geography and to our economic reality and to the fact that we are always strapped of cash and we have more important things where to invest on? So, this is a good question. Moreover, if Toyota decides to say, we are going to make a hybrid car that's going to work both on ethanol and gasoline and with a battery. And because ethanol is so cheap, instead of using lithium, we'll try using aluminum batteries. They keep energy for less time. They are not as good as lithium batteries. But if you have ethanol, a lot of ethanol, we can continue to sport a lithium and have very cheap batteries. So there is a problem of identifying demand. So energy and geopolitics in Brazil will be very much tied. That's why 2 weeks ago, Saudi Arabia made a huge meeting in Rio. They want to invest in almost any startup. It doesn't have to be in energy, okay? They want to be present for a market. And therefore, this is where we are right now. I'm not saying that we have a clear policy yet. We don't have a clear policy because we have many problems, many discussions on other subjects that are occupying our time, but we are bound to come to a clear policy, especially when we will have to spend money to implement it. So this is going to push us in one very interesting direction. We are self-sufficient. Contrary to what is said here, Joaquin said this yesterday, we reduced in these 18 months, we reduced the destruction of the Amazon forest by much. And I have to remind you that we have about 88 or 90% of the original Amazon forest, and if you do the same comparison with European forests, I think that you have 8% or 18%, something like that. So don't scold us. And also, we don't burn coal except for making steel. Okay, it's very rare that we burn coal. Our thermoelectric power has been adapted to both oil and gas. And we are spreading wind power in the northeast of Brazil. So for this period of the next 20 years, if there is no armed conflict in the world, and I'll explain that, Brazil is very safe, very protected in terms of energy. When I say conflict, because of course, if there is a conflict, we'll have to take one side, and the next day, our platforms in the ocean will be destroyed by the other side. Okay, so this is the only tricky thing that we have. So, to finish what I had to say, I'm quite convinced that oil is traded in dollars, and oil is the most important source of energy in the world right now, not for Brazil, but for the world, for one very simple reason. 2 carriers permanently in the Persian Gulf, 10 carriers in total. It's a projection of power. This is why oil is traded in dollars. It's not because of the quality of American public finances. Okay? So we in Brazil have better public finances. It's amazing. I'm not saying that we have good public finances. I'm saying that we have better. On the other hand, if you remember 1956, when the Brits and the French were told, get off from Suez by Americans and Russians, you must remember that soon after, the British presence was voluntarily reduced in the Persian Gulf. And until then, you still traded, less and less so, oil in pounds. And oil is not traded in pounds anymore, not that I know. So, the role of a dollar being an international currency, international reserve currency, depends on this control of the sea lanes, control of the areas that produce the real currency, which is energy. And, of course, there is a question of the South China Sea, but that's not the subject of this talk. Okay, so thank you very much. I don't know if I should ask questions or not, but I think we don't have time.
I think we can move to the...
Okay.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite the panelists of the first session on stage, and Marco, the moderator.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cinzia. So let's have all the speakers here, and Stefano Soro from the European Union, DG Grow, and then Romolo Sampaio and Mallory. So now, in this first panel, we are going to discuss about industrial policies, new industrial policies, and link between industrial policies, energy transition, green transition, and international trade. And so we will have an overview of what is happening now in the European Union. First with Stefano Soro, which is leading the agenda for the Net Zero Industry Act. Then Romolo Sampaio will explain us about the situation of energy transition in Brazil and the regulation movement. And then Mallory will have a bridge with the second panel, talking about international trade and industrial policies and energy transition. So please, Stefano.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'll do without the ice cream there. There are people online, so I won't do without the ice cream. Okay. As a good bureaucrat, I'll start from the conclusion. I'm going to give you a bit of a framework view on the Net Zero Industry Act. Nothing Brazil specific, but there's a point I would like to make, so I will make it now. Maybe I'll make it again at the end. You know, the Tony Blair School of Oratory, repeat the message until it's hammered in the head of those who are listening. So building and expanding on the EU-Brazil trade relations in the area of net zero technology is extremely important. You have heard from the ambassadors and from the president the figures on Brazil's share of renewables. You have heard about dependencies and Europe being caught. This is Chatham House, right? Sure. Being caught with no, it's online. Being caught unawares a bit with Russian gas. We got out of it very effectively. I don't know how efficiently, because it was very expensive to get out of it suddenly, and the desirability of replacing a dependency with another one is a big issue. So, I mean, having a relationship is beneficial to all and reflects the very core of the Net Zero Industry Act, of which a bit more later, and where the EU is currently heading, namely the need for diversifying sources of supply of critical technologies, clean technologies, and their components, dependencies of single sources have to become a thing of the past. We cannot credibly put our eggs in the same basket again. So we have done it successfully to a point with Russian gas and oil to a certain extent. We are looking out dependencies on China in particular, on clean tech. Brazil too, I think, is doing it to a certain extent, especially because the South China Sea was briefly mentioned. And again, it's a matter of managing the dependencies. What is the Net Zero Industry Act? By the way, the Net Zero Industry Act is going to be, it was adopted finally on the 27th of May, is going to be published on the official journal of the European Union next Friday and will enter into force next Saturday. So the final text will be available in all languages next week. It's basically a way to address the dependencies I was mentioning now. We are heading towards a decade that will be decisive for us meaning the world, to limit the rising in global GHG emissions and in temperatures, and to take the necessary steps towards net zero. With the European Green Deal, we have set our ambition to reach to become carbon neutral by 2050 with a number of intermediary steps. And to reach these objectives, we need to move away from fossil fuels as fast as we can. We started doing all this for reasons of environmental and climate sustainability, to address climate change, the rising temperatures, etc., etc. The COVID pandemics and the explosion of the price of material inputs, and in particular of energy costs, when the pandemic receded, brought to the surface clear issues of economic and financial sustainability of our model. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia, this brutal aggression, showed that we were made us realize that we're very dependent on Russian gas. In particular, some member states, in particular the member state I know best, which is Italy, and Germany, Austria, Hungary, a number of them, less so other member states like France and Spain for other reasons. So the analysis of this dependency brought to the surface the realization that we need to take care also of the political and geopolitical sustainability of our model. And across all this, there is a sort of cross-cutting dimension of sustainability which is extremely important, and it's social sustainability. If we take action to decarbonize ourselves, to reduce emissions, action that stops at our borders, we end up desertifying industrial Europe, damaging badly our most vulnerable strata of population and regions, destroying our social cohesion, and being very stupid because we would do, in any case, the planet no favor, because what happens if you decarbonize by industrializing, someone else will pick up the productions, the emissions, and the jobs. You export jobs and emissions instead of goods produced sustainably. And that's not very smart. So, to cut a long story short, about a year and a half ago, the president of the Commission came out with the Green Deal Industrial Plan, which is a bit of a summary of all these considerations, which has 4 pillars, glossing very quickly. One is regulatory, and it's a Critical Raw Materials Act and the Net Zero Industry Act in a nutshell. Another one is financing, the STEP coming up. There are other initiatives in the pipeline. One is skills, because skills for a changing economy, for the transition, are one of the main bottlenecks to success. If you talk to those who are expanding productions, and very notably Northvolt, which is a large and expanding producer of batteries, US Swedish based initially, they will tell you that as other industry business representatives, that one of the main bottlenecks to their expansion, their successful expansions, is the availability of skilled staff to accompany the transition. And fourth, but not least, the international dimension. No one in their right mind is thinking that we can move towards autarky. No one is thinking that. We are a relatively small part of the world, densely populated and not so rich in natural resources. On top of that, we've been one of the main beneficiaries of 20 or 30 years previous to the recent crisis of growing and free trade. It's made us rich. On the other hand, it has sort of brought to the surface two weaknesses. One is overdependencies, and the other one is a weakening of our manufacturing base. So the Green Deal Industrial Plan, in a way, wants to address this. The Net Zero Industry Act is an important part of this picture. And the aim of the Net Zero Industry Act, which has been very wrongly labeled repeatedly as the European response to the US Inflation Reduction Act, I'll get to that in a minute. What it wants to do is the objective of the Net Zero Industry Act is to give Europe a regulatory framework that ensures that, on the one hand, we have a core of manufacturing in Europe to allow us not to be caught unawares. I was about to say it with our pants down, in case of crisis, on the one hand, and on the other hand, helps us diversify away from single sources of supply. That's what it does in terms of objectives in a nutshell. The fact that it's been labeled as the European response to the Inflation Reduction Act is a sort of a half-truth or a quarter-truth. I personally vehemently contest the idea that industrial policy in the Western world came back on the table with the IRA. There is already in Next Generation EU and in the Resilience and Recovery and Resilience Facility a notion of public money and a notion of support for the green transition, including decarbonization, et cetera, et cetera. So that's not true. What is true, and it's undeniable, is that we are 27 sovereign member states. We are a union of sovereign member states. So we don't have anything as immediate and beautiful as, tax credits that are one of the cornerstones of the Inflation Reduction Act. So our measures are more filtered through national or regional authorities, are a bit more awkward, cumbersome, different, et cetera, et cetera. But that said, I mean, there's a lot of public money. There's an extension of the state aid rules with the TCTF for clean tech that it's been taken advantage of, in particular by those member states which have deeper pockets. And there's a lot of action going on. In a very, very short couple of minutes, and then I'll close. The main pillars of the Net Zero Industry Act are, first of all, upfront, there's no new European public money in the Net Zero Industry Act. There is not a chapter dedicated to establishing new funds or raising new funds for this. So that's another difference with the US IRA, which, by the way, was budgeted in the beginning to be in the region of $370 billion, we are already beyond $800 billion. And there are studies, there's one good study done by Daniel Gross et al. You might know him in this part of town. He's now working with the Bocconi University Institute for European Policymaking, which estimates that unless they change, the US change a new administration or the follow-up to this administration changes the rule, are going to be well above $1 trillion. Anyway, first thing, permitting. Permitting for deployment and permitting for manufacturing technologies is a significant bottleneck. You talk to industry in clean tech, in particular wind and solar, but not only, they will tell you it's one of the factors that has put the European manufacturing industry in a bad position compared to competition, in particular Chinese and East Asian. So there are a number of provisions to simplify and accelerate the permitting processes. We had proposed a tacit agreement in the Commission proposal. This did not go past the member states for obvious reasons. They don't want to be told by Brussels how to do things, and it's in fact, for some administrations in particular, quite a burden because they will have to recruit, train, and install new stuff. Investment, it's about having mechanisms to crowd in private investments in net zero strategic projects, which have dedicated provisions which facilitate their adoption and their support by member states. Access to markets, public buyers are important buyers of clean tech and of energy produced with renewables, so there are provisions for public procurement and tenders of clean action, which introduce non-price criteria, in particular sustainability and resilience criteria in auctions and public procurement and public support measures. Skills, we are launching Net Zero Academies. One of the first ones was launched, the first one actually was launched publicly yesterday, the Battery Academy. It's not a physical academy, but it's a development of syllabi or of programs for portable and exportable programs for training, upskilling and reskilling staff for the transition. Innovation, we don't have a fixed picture of technologies. We have an evolving movie of technologies, so there are provisions for regulatory sandboxes which allow the testing of innovative technologies in a legally controlled environment for a limited amount of time. And then governance, there's a platform where member states, together with the Commission and stakeholders as required, will coordinate action jointly, including on international partnerships. Back to square one, I think it's going to be the subject of back to the beginning of my intervention, it's going to be the subject of much of the discussion here, in particular regarding the bilateral relationship between Brazil and the EU. Very important that action is taken globally to reduce emission globally, and it's better if we diversify out of single source dependencies in a bigger bunch than on our own. Very much has happened with the procurement of vaccines, which was a great success story of Europe. I think that's also left a sign that united we're stronger. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano. Very interesting. I have some questions, but we leave it for after the. And now, Romolo, would you like to use a presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So Romolo will introduce us to the Brazilian side of the green and energy transition.
Thank you. So while these slides come up, I want to thank FGV Europe, the President Carlos Ivan and Cesar Campos for the kind invitation and for holding these events, and of course CEPS, who is our hosting institution here. Also salute, and also to my deans, Sergio Guerra and Antonio Porto. Antonio, who is here, also a special thank you for this kind invitation. I think we will have a panel that is following this one with very good names that can provide really good analysis of what's going on in Brazil. So I'm going to try to show some data about what's happening in an energy transition field in Brazil so that the next panelist can perhaps provide more details and insights of the data that I'm going to show you. So before I show you this data, what is happening? So I think the first story we need to say here, where was the world in 2015 when we agreed with the Sustainable Development Goals? And Sustainable Development Goal number 7 was the one that stated affordable and clean energy. So we had 87% of the world with some form of electricity, but yet 1.1 billion were still lacking access to energy. Oil price plunged to an all-time low, and fossil fuels dominated the market with global investments amounting to $1.3 trillion. Coal accounted for nearly 40% of the global electricity and 60% of the population with access to clean cooking fuels. So it was not a very optimistic scenario in 2005 when we agree with this development goal. So when we look to the graphic, we can see that there was a great increase in investment from 2015 to 2023 in renewable energy. We can see that the lighter blue there shows the amount of investments in billion dollars of the money that was channeled to sustainable development. So it was a big increase in money, and we can see that the money reduced for fossil fuels. So where is the world in 2023, 8 years after we agree on Sustainable Development Goal number 7? 91% access to electricity. So that was a significant increase. Renewables now account for more than 28% of global electricity. It was growing by nearly 5% since 2015. Global investment has skyrocketed to 1.7 trillion, as we saw in the previous graphic. But 2.3 billion people in the world still rely on coal. Kerosene or solid biomass is the primary cooking fuel, mostly in sub-Saharan countries and least developing countries. Lack of clean cooking is contributing to nearly 3.7 million premature deaths annually, and about 80% of the world's population without electricity continues to live in rural areas. 80% of the world without electricity in rural areas. So those are the challenges we have today. And when interpreting the data of 2015 and 2023, the United Nations Sustainable Development Group concluded that while we see some progress, this hasn't been fast enough nor as inclusive as we need. So that's the general conclusion. When we talk about energy transition, and I like this, this is the energy transition trilemma, I think it's very important to bear in mind that transition needs to be reliable, affordable, and green. If we don't meet these 3 goals or objectives, we'll not be able to transition to a greener and more sustainable way of generating power. It has to be reliable, it has to be affordable. And so those are the challenges, not only sustainable, but reliable and affordable. So what's the scenario in Brazil? Brazil, as our president said, already transitioned to a green, to a greener energy environment. As we can see, there is still quite a few reliance on oil, and I don't think we will see any significant decrease in the near term. But when you look to biomass, it's a significant part of our energy matrix, and all the other renewables are pretty significant when we compare the graphics of the world current energy landscape with Brazil current energy landscape. So when we look ahead, when we look to the data of the World Economic Forum, Brazil ranks 14 out of 120 countries on the Energy Transition Index. Brazil has seen an 80% improvement since 2014. 80% of Brazil's electricity is coming from large hydropower plants, and I think here is the challenge. As we heard from Minister Levy yesterday, climate change has been putting a lot of pressure on this very special source of energy generation in Brazil. Brazil's electricity sector is one of the least carbon intensive in the world. And as I said, climate change now is the challenge ahead. So when we look at Brazil's sustainable low carbon policies, they were very successful, uncoordinated though, but yet very successful. There were quite a few since 2015 throughout the 21st century. So we had the auctions that were very successful for the Renewable Energy Support Program launched in 2004 that attracted a lot of investment for the renewable energy sector. The Brazilian Development Bank approved a $650 million in financing for wind and solar energy power. So this was a big driver of the energy transition in Brazil. The program of incentives for alternative electricity sources paved the way to create local manufacturing capacity. So Brazil now manufactures wind turbines. Micro and mini generations promote distributed solar generation is very successful. So there is a huge network of mini and micro generation. And you will hear from Macedo, from Raízen, who will talk to you about the importance of this ethanol market for Brazil. RenovaBio was another very successful policy that led Brazil to this transition. So what is next? Well, if we look to the Brazilian energy matrix, we see that we already have a lot of green in our matrix. But Brazil loses about 16% of the power it generates. That's a big loss, in part due to what Professor Carlos Ivan pointed out. We have a very complex distribution grid that needs new and better investment in infrastructure, particularly in remote areas where the potential for renewable energy development exists. We have huge areas of great renewable energy potential, but we have no grid to bring this energy to the major consumer market. A recent World Economic Forum report highlights opportunities for the country to unlock the clean energy investments, and it focuses on three main aspects: distributed generation, hydropower, and clean energy access for isolated systems. So creating a distributed generation financing toolbox. Here are some of the regulatory tools available. I'm not going to spend much time on this. And I think the last issue before I conclude is carbon pricing, because this has been a big policy under debate in Brazil. Shall we put a price on carbon? And a lot of this demand on carbon pricing is coming from Europe, especially on the CBAM, the taxation that Europe is trying to impose on the Brazilian, on the industries outside Europe, so that to match the pricing that it's going on here. But is that something we need to spend so much energy in Brazil discussing? When we look to the Brazilian data of greenhouse gas emissions, we see that energy, it's a very small portion of the Brazilian emissions. And we need to account that Brazil emits 3%. It's responsible for roughly 3% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And most of the Brazilian emissions do not come from electricity. 2/3 of these emissions is deforestation and land use patterns. So energy in the Brazil sector is roughly 20%. and most of this is transportation. And that's, again, the role of ethanol here is really important for the decarbonizing of the energy matrix, because out of this 20%, 50% of that is transportation. When we talk about our industries that will be the most affected by a carbon pricing, Brazilian industry is responsible for roughly 3.5%. Those are the guys who will pay the carbon pricing because agriculture is excluded from the bill that it's almost to be approved before Congress. So we are talking about putting a tax or a price in the carbon of 3.5% of the Brazilian industry emissions, on 3.5% of the Brazilians' emissions that are concentrated in industry, in a country that it's responsible for 3% of the world's emissions. So the big question is, should we spend all of this energy we're currently spending on talking about the carbon credit market in Brazil as a type of pricing to decarbonize the Brazilian industry, or we have other better ways to do it? Nobody is dipping or taking the time to ask this hard question. So the key takeaways, I think, to conclude, we need to continue to expand our renewable energy sources. The Global Journal newspaper, one of the major outlets in Brazil, has just published a study a couple of days ago showing that artificial intelligence will increase energy demand in Brazil twofold in the next decade. So that's a big debate. There is an increasing investment in the modernization and expansion of the grid infrastructure that was highlighted by Professor Carlos Ivan. We need to enhance energy efficiency. We need to focus on decarbonizing the transport sector. Investing in energy storage and smart grid technologies are also a major takeaway. And of course, all of that will demand good policy and regulatory coordination and incentives. So with that, thank you so much. And I will.
Thank you very much, Romulo. It was really interesting, this overview of data and the positioning of Brazil in relationship to this evolution. And I have a question too, but after. And then I would like to give a word to Mallory Schaus, and that I think will help us to look at the connection.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm actually very glad to be on this panel discussing EU-Brazil partnership, because it relates on the one hand on openness, open trade, cooperation, but also sustainable trade and investment. And I think it's worth recalling why open trade is important. Open trade is important because it's really theoretical, but based on its comparative advantages and the economies of scale, it contributes to economic growth, to innovation, to investments, to consumer choice, to quality, and to global sustainable development. Global sustainable development is not just poverty reduction, but it's also the green transition. And very important and sometimes forgotten is that the rules-based multilateral trading system that underpins open trade has as one of its fundamental principles the principle of security and predictability. And this is essential for doing business. Now, as we know all, open trade is currently seriously challenged, and the related policies, notably trade policies, have to adjust to this overall changing landscape. What I mean is first the green dynamic, but also the geo-economic dynamic. Means that we are now at a historic level of weaponized trade relations, of protectionist measures. We are in a period of heightened geopolitical tensions more broadly, and China, the rise of China, the turn of China towards a more assertive tone and towards a more authoritarian, if not totalitarian turn, has also to be mentioned as part of this geo-economic dynamic. On the EU side, the EU trade policy has been reoriented towards open strategic autonomy. In more recent terms is economic security. In more concrete terms is de-risking, as already mentioned previously. And this has been translated into the EU trade policy into a diversification strategy. Diversification, why? For securing the access to key inputs, and so the supply of key inputs, but also for access to external growth markets, so means for our exports. And so the diversification strategy is aimed to answer, of course, to the overdependencies that we have in some critical sectors, critical raw materials, clean technology, and this in particular with respect to China. But it is also, and this we don't have to forget, it's also aimed to respond to the rising global demand and global competition for key inputs, critical raw materials in particular, that are essential for the green and digital transition. So in other words, this diversification policy is aimed at enhancing the resilience of the EU economy and its supply chains, and thereby contributes to enhanced sustainability. When we look at this diversification policy, what we can understand is that the open strategic autonomy turn of the EU trade policy remains essentially founded on openness, but maximization of openness, because there are vulnerabilities that we have to minimize. In other words, partnering with the broadest possible range of partners of countries is essential and remains a priority for the EU. Now, we cannot speak of pure openness, and it's never pure openness. There is always some degree of autonomy. But we can speak of strategic openness, because we are living in a second-best world, in a world where trade relations are fragmenting. And so it means that we have to pay it, that this world of fragmenting trade relations may lead to an enhanced spaghetti bowl effects with overlapping regulations. And this we have to avoid contributing too much to this. And also important to mention is that the EU, despite its open strategic autonomy turn, aims to keep its trade and investment policies anchored within the rules-based multilateral trading system. This is still the goal of all these policies, despite the reorientation. Now, the EU-Brazil partnership fits, and with respect to the green energy transition, fits into this framework of diversification. And in particular with the reshuffling of supply chain that we are observing in recent years, the 2 last years, actually emerging and developing economies like Brazil actually may play a more important role. And Brazil, in this respect, may stand out from the crowd because it's rich in some critical raw materials. Its energy matrix has long been one of the most renewable in the world. And so it is for Brazil now to decide whether it seizes the opportunities on a case-by-case basis, or whether, more structurally, Brazil decides to position itself as a future manufacturing hub. And this, I think, could actually be likely, and even more likely, given that Brazil, as other countries, is also reassessing its dependencies on China in light of the over-dependencies. Now, what I think is very important in speaking of a EU-Brazil partnership, or more broadly with the Mercosur region, is that for this partnership to be sound and eventually successful, it needs to fulfill some criteria. The first one is it needs to be founded on reciprocity. Reciprocity is exactly, so it means based on the comparative advantage of both partners. But it needs also to tend towards globalization and to act as a building block in support of the rules-based multilateral trading system. And there are 2 traps, and why these conditions? Because there are 2 traps that we have to avoid. The first trap, as I mentioned, with these fragmenting trade relations, is that we have to avoid reinforcing the spaghetti ball effect with overlapping regulations. And on the other hand, what we have observed in the past is that geopolitical affiliations may be very fragile and unstable because there may be a tendency towards polarization and enhanced tensions. And so we have also to avoid this trap. Now, how can we actually translate this EU-Brazil partnership best to serve this green energy transition? And there I have three areas that I would like to discuss. More regional, the EU-Mercosur FTA, which still needs ratification, a global decarbonization partnership, and then the WTO. So first, I think that there would be a need, and it would be very essential to pursue and to eventually ratify the EU-Mercosur FTA. We know, so it has been politically concluded in 2019 after 20 years of negotiations, and we know that there have been oppositions, now there are still oppositions, notably on the part of France for agricultural reasons. But the global importance of the EU-Mercosur FTA is significant. Economically, because both parties, the EU and Brazil together, they account for around 20% of the world GDP. But also geopolitically, because we know that the region of South America is very much in a competition for influence, also with China, and then directly and indirectly, this FTA can contribute to the green transition. It is actually a quite ambitious agreement that involves the full liberalization of almost all trade in goods between both parties. But in addition, it aims to facilitate the trade in services on a non-discriminatory basis. It aims to reduce still existing non-tariff barriers like the customs, long and burdensome customs procedures or other unnecessary and discriminatory barriers. Also important to mention is that it foresees the reciprocal liberalization of public procurement. And this is significant as the Mercosur economies and Brazil are not yet a part of the WTO plurilateral on government procurement, and then it comprises, like most now of the EU FTAs, provisions on environmental protection and social rights. Now it is true that for the EU-Mercosur FTA will have a rather, at first sight at least, a rather limited economic impact. Why? Because the EU trade in goods and services with Mercosur represents around 1 to 2% of the EU's foreign trade. Nevertheless, in a context of economic security, with the need to enhance resilience and to improve sustainability, the agreement retains all its relevance. Why? Because the Mercosur economies are still very much protected, notably with high tariffs, but also, as I mentioned already, burdensome procedures and technical regulations and standards that are not in line already with the international standards. And with this FTA, we would remove the tariffs on most of the EU exported goods, including machinery, chemicals, vehicles that may actually be relevant for the green transition. And as I mentioned, it builds also on facilitating trade in services with the possibility of local establishment. It also tackles non-tariff barriers, so easing business within the Mercosur region and Brazil. And the agreement will also ease the access to public contracts by EU firms. In other words, for the EU-Mercosur FTA will support further beyond the exports of goods, will support further investments, but also the integration into supply chains in the Mercosur region by EU firms, and this based on high standards. So, in other words, this FTA could actually provide relevant incentives for EU firms to de-risk and to develop production line or further develop production line in the Mercosur region in support of the green transition, and it is already a known territory for EU firms. Another important point is critical raw materials and access to critical raw materials, because the EU-Mercosur FTA would lead to either lower or remove some of the export taxes and restrictions on critical raw materials. Now, on the side of the Mercosur and Brazil, this agreement would have a more important economic impact, simply because the trade with the EU is more important for the Mercosur economies. So it's around 17 and 26% of the Mercosur foreign trade when we take trade in goods and trade in services. And similarly, for the Mercosur and Brazil firms, it would also facilitate the investment inside the supply chains in the EU, which are also turning towards the green transition. The second point is that the EU-Mercosur FTA is important on its own, but it could also play a relevant role more globally in support of an idea that has been put forward by Alicia Garcia Herrero, a global decarbonization partnership, which would consist in the creation of complementary supply chains for the decarbonization efforts, and complementary to those that exist with what we know, the overdependencies on China. Now, such a partnership would have to rely on an incentive alignment with the international partners. So there we would have to look at the comparative advantages of the different partners, notably, and also be based on common standards. Then the third point is the WTO. So the EU-Brazil partnership could also serve the green transition by acting in support of the rules-based multilateral trading system and the reinforcement of the WTO disciplines, notably based on the bilateral and regional initiatives that are being taken by the different members. Now, you're going to tell me, yeah, but the rules-based multilateral trading system, its effectiveness is put under serious strain. This is right, because, as I mentioned, of the geopolitical tensions, but also the weaponization of trade relations, the protectionist measures, and the great power competition, if not confrontation, between China and the US. But at this critical juncture, actually, we need not less WTO, but we need more WTO. And there I make a reference to what I said about openness. It is actually the rules-based multilateral trading system that provides the fundamental principle of openness, fairness, non-discrimination, and security and predictability. And this in support of peace and prosperity. This is not going to change. And as I mentioned already, the EU trade policy remains anchored to the greatest extent possible within the rules-based multilateral trading system. Now the question is, how has the WTO already contributed to sustainable trade, and how could it still further support sustainable trade? And it's important to recall that since already 1995, the WTO agreement contains in its preamble a fundamental objective, a founding objective, which is to use trade for the promotion of sustainable development, including the protection and preservation of the environment. And on this basis, the WTO has already contributed to some extent to sustainable trade based on some relevant rules and the establishment already in 1995 of the Committee on Trade and Environment. Most recently, I think that you have all heard that at MC12 we have been able to, the members have been able to conclude a multilateral agreement on fisheries subsidies, which is actually the first agreement, multilateral agreement at the WTO, which has environmental sustainability at its core. Now, I would personally even argue that since MC12, so the Ministerial Conference of the WTO, the 12th one in 2022, the WTO is in a reform process, We may say that, and we have observed that MC13 in Abu Dhabi in February was less fruitful than MC12, but some results have been achieved. And also, and this I think it's important because it's going to be a long-term process, we see some significant groundwork that has been laid down in the ministerial declaration for future discussions and negotiations, including the recognition in the ministerial declaration of the importance of trade and sustainable development in its three fundamental pillars. Now, how could the WTO further support sustainable trade? First, based on the action, of course, of its members, the EU, Brazil, and all other members, it could first revive the environmental goods agreements negotiations that have been suspended in 2016. And it has indeed been observed that dirtier industries that are more upstream are actually subject to less tariffs than more downstream, cleaner industries. So if we would lift the greater protection on the cleaner industries more downstream, it would not only lead to more economic development, but also lead to addressing the climate change. Now here we know that the developing countries, including Brazil, have no longer supported in the past this initiative, but I think that with the global changing context, they could be brought back to the negotiation table based notably on the bilateral and other regional initiatives that are undertaken. Now, another important stream, I think, and there we see concrete progress, relates to fossil fuel subsidies and the rationalization of those inefficient subsidies, which is a plurilateral initiative. And in the ministerial declaration of MC13, the parties include a clear program of work towards MC14 in 2 years. And in other words, the parties that are, so the members that are party to this plurilateral initiative, they are going to develop a timetable for phased reduction pathway with respect to fossil fuel subsidies. And this is supported by the COP28 of last year, where there is also a call for phasing out those inefficient subsidies. Now, Brazil is not part of this plurilateral initiative, while it is a major player in clean energy, and so perhaps it could also join this initiative. Now, more broadly, the WTO legal disciplines on subsidies should be clarified and modernized with respect to major trends. And there, it's important to recall that, of course, when we hear about subsidies, we see China and the subsidies that are used for competitiveness reasons. We also observe the subsidy race. But first and foremost, it's important to recall that since 2009, subsidies represent the vast majority of trade intervention. And this is notably linked to the nature of the global economy, which is based on supply chain production and trade. And so there, the modernization would link these subsidy disciplines to not only trade in goods, but also trade in services and investment. But then, of course, the subsidies may be heavily used for competitiveness reasons, notably by state-led economies. And as we observe, we are in a period of subsidy competition between different public authorities, which is necessarily welfare reducing. But on the other hand, those subsidies may be used to support the green transition. And so that's why we need clarification and reinforcement of the WTO legal disciplines in this respect. Some analytical work has been done by the WTO and other international organizations in this respect to develop a common understanding as to the magnitude of the subsidies, their effects, their aims. And so on this basis, I think actually that the plurilateral initiative should be undertaken to support those the tightening of the WTO subsidies. The EU is already part of a trilateral cooperation with the US and Japan, and this cooperation could be extended to other members. Now, there is also often a question when we hear about subsidies, the question how to escape this subsidy race. And one alternative that is and has been discussed, notably as part of the TTC, EU-US TTC, and the TIST initiative, the Transatlantic Initiative on Sustainable Trade, is public procurement. In particular, green public procurement. Now, the WTO, as I mentioned, includes plurilateral agreement on government procurement. And in this respect, as I mentioned, Brazil is not yet part of it, but the EU-Mercosur FTA could be a first step towards this direction of joining the WTO plurilateral agreement on government procurement, and this would actually help also perhaps to improve those rules towards the green transition. And to conclude, I'd like to say that the EU-Brazil partnership with respect to the green energy transition represents a good example of how best to navigate the troubled waters of the fragmenting global economy in supporting re-globalization, that's to say the more comprehensive integration of emerging economies, and notably Brazil, in the global value chains, and also in contributing to the revitalization of the WTO. In this way, the EU may actually progressively set itself up as a normative model founded on the rules-based multilateral trading system and counter the opposing winds of dislocation. And there I would like to recall as a last word what the dislocation would mean. It would represent a major cost for the global economy, from 7 to 12% losses in GDP. It would lead to reduced prosperity, soaring prices, slower growth, slower innovation, rising social risk, instability, increased risk of conflicts, and at the end, less economic security. So I think it's very important to build a strong EU-Brazil partnership with a global perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for your overview about all this complex question about international trade and the role of WTO. I would like to make some short, very short answer. So a short question to all the speakers. Stefano, what about this idea of an EU-Brazil partnership for net zero clean technology? You think that there is room for this?
Well, I think I said so. Yes, we are going out once next week once the regulation enters into force. I think, as we were discussing between us this morning, I think this is probably more relevant. Or no, not more relevant. It's going to be immediately in the short term bigger for critical raw materials than for industrial products, but absolutely, we are basically two democratic blocks which have an issue with dependencies on technologies that we all need, like wind and batteries and solar PV and innovative nuclear technologies, etc., etc. So I think that it comes quite naturally. It's not going to be simple, but it comes quite naturally. We've been in a state of sort of turbulence for the last 16 years or so. And this turbulence is also due, in a known negligible part, to imbalances in our dependencies in these areas going forward in particular. So yes.
Thank you very much, Stefano. And Romulo, We know that in the Senate in Brazil there is a discussion about a new law about hydrogen and what do you think about the question of how the Brazilian government is going to regulate decarbonized production, we can say, including hydrogen, green steel, and green fertilizer, and so on. There is a chance to have a new regulation in the next year, for example.
I believe so, and I think the question will be how much money the government is willing to invest, I think. But our former Minister of Finance said we don't have any money. Question for the government. Like the United States had with IRA and invested in $1 trillion, I don't think we're there yet. But I think it will be a matter of how much finding the money.
Melanie, you think that the idea to have a EU-Brazil partnership in this question about manufacturing and green and clean technologies could be something that is linked with the Mercosur or agreement, EU-Mercosur agreement, or could be something that could be have a line or development line which is independent from the general agreement?
I think so. I mentioned, of course, the EU-Mercosur FTA, but when you look at the diversification strategy of the EU, it actually plays on different fronts. So you have this network of FTAs, but then we'll discuss the second panel, the global gateway. There are other types of what they call engagement policies, like international strategic partnerships that we have with Canada, with the US. We have also other types like TTC, which is more bilateral. So we are really in a stage actually also to explore the best way to do it, and we have to pay attention that what we do is not going to reinforce too much the spaghetti ball effects, even though we know that we are in this period of coexistence of non-exclusive regulatory frameworks.
Thank you very much to all. I think that now we have a coffee break. Yes, and then the second panel. We go direct. 10 minutos. 10 minutos.
right, welcome back everybody to this second panel. My name is Berta Miche. I'm the female of the group. I'm the moderator for today. So I'll introduce them, do a bit of housekeeping, and then we can set right off. So firstly, we have with us Ambassador Pedro Miguel Costa y Silva. Apologies for everyone for my accent. I'm Hungarian, so I'm very far removed. Who is the Brazilian ambassador to the European Union. And if I saw correctly, he knows about 80% of you personally. So next we have Henrique Galan, who is the senior loan officer responsible for Brazil in the European Investment Bank. Then we have Joaquim Levy, who is the former Brazilian finance minister and the current president of the board of Banco Safra. And if I understand, we will be talking about ethanol, perhaps, but we will see. Maybe not. Maybe I've been lied to. You can do that. In that case, Paul Lumesedu will be talking about ethanol. He is the Global Director of International Relations at Tyson. Okay, housekeeping. We are already a little bit over time, and I will be fairly strict with these people, so apologies in advance. I will also be strict with the audience when it comes to your questions, so please, when it comes to the audience questions, think about what you want to say, introduce yourself, respect other people's time, and then we can actually get in a lot of, I think, good information. Ambassador, just between us two, I have to tell you a little bit of a secret. I am Hungarian. My expertise is not in Brazilian net zero investments. So I was wondering if you could give me a little bit of an introduction into the current initiatives happening in this area.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank FGV, and I want to thank CEPS for inviting me and my colleagues, the ones that really know about these issues who are sitting in the back. So if you make any complicated, ask any complicated questions, I'll pass the floor to them. I have the privilege of speaking after the introduction by the ambassador of Brazil to Belgium and Luxembourg, Ambassador João Mendes, who spoke about the Brazilian situation and where we are and our potential, and also Romulo made a very good presentation also about Brazil, so I can skip that part and I will certainly keep to time. I think that I will briefly address what we are already doing with the EU in this area of energy and what we could do more. So I think those are my 2 points. And I think the starting point is that we share several objectives. We want to increase our use of renewable energies. I think we want to increase energy efficiency. We want to modernize, digitalize, expand energy infrastructure. As was already said, that it's one of our necessities, at least in case of Brazil. And we want to make this transition, this energy transition, coupled with a new kind of industrialization, with the promotion, in the case of Brazil, of our agricultural sector. I think this also applies to the EU and the pressing issue of the circular economy, in which we have different views, but we are going to work together with the EU. And we want, of course, and this was said by our EU Commission colleague, we want to generate jobs and technology in our spaces. What do we have so far? What do we have at this stage? Well, we have a Brazil-EU energy dialogue, which is inside our strategic partnership from 2007. But just to tell you how much space we have to work in, this meeting happened in 2024, after 7 years of no meetings. So this shows you we need more continuity, and we need to keep on working. And not only at the technical level, we need a political push. If you want, maybe we could have a dialogue on energy at the ministerial level. We have a series, the EU-Mercosur agreement was discussed here, and I'm not going to get into that, but of course there is a discussion there. Not only there was a discussion in the past, but we are now currently negotiating very quietly. And there is, of course, the need to adjust some parts of the agreement to the new realities, including the realities concerning energy and energy transition. EU, the EU and some of its member states are our partners in the G20, where we have a very significant track in terms of energy transition, sustainable development, climate change. So there we're working with the EU. We are working with the EU in other multilateral fora in terms of energy. Here we had mentioned already of the issue of the global gateway projects. Some of them small have started, others are being discussed, and we're working with the EU to make sure that whatever they have in terms of initiatives of the global gateway and also Team Europe initiatives that were also mentioned here before by previous speakers, that we do that in tandem, that we profit of projects that already exist in Brazil, for example, and that we can then not try to reinvent things and create synergies. And we have specific projects of interest of the Brazilian government, federal government, of the EU authorities, of, in the case of Brazil, of specific Brazilian states of our federation. We had a recent visit of governors of the northeast of Brazil, and we had the information here before of the very positive conditions that they have in terms of, for projects, not only in terms of solar energy, wind, but especially now hydrogen, green hydrogen. So there are a series of projects and partnerships that are being built and studied between our states, European firms, Brazilian enterprises, and the federal government, and of course the EU. And the idea here is that the global gateway will finance or help finance some of the initial projects and the ideas. And I will conclude, keeping time.
Wonderful.
How can we improve the possibilities that we have in front of us? So I already mentioned the fact that we need to boost our energy dialogue, not so that it is not only at the technical level, but also it is at the political level, and that it happens more frequently. We need, I think, to examine closely what we already have on the table. There are a series of European initiatives. I mentioned Global Gateway, but you also have Euroclima, Horizon Europe, the EU Climate Dialogues, you have the EU Hydrogen Bank. There is and I think you're going maybe to touch on this, the Renewable and Low Carbon Fuels Value Chain and Industrial Alliance. There are a series of things that are ongoing, but maybe we need to take a look at all of this together to see how we can really make this into something that has another dimension. Since we have been also speaking here about geopolitics and the new moment, if you look, and I'm not going to make any comparisons, but if you look at what Brazil is doing with other international partners and you compare it with what we're doing with the EU, it's still very little. So we need there's a lot of potential, and we can increase that. There is the possibility of trilateral cooperation, and here I would diverge a bit from Mr. Simonsen, the president of FGV. I think that we are moving forward in the issue of ethanol and biofuels, even though the EU doesn't like them very much. And I think that there is a possibility for cooperation in third countries where the idea of the electric car is maybe not the best solution. And I would finalize with the issue that was already raised here, I think, by Romulo in the case of Brazil, but I think it applies to the bilateral relationship, which is discussing standards and norms and working together there to make sure that they are technologically neutral and adaptive so that we can accommodate our different realities and our different pathways in terms of energy transition, and this will foster investment, foster trade, and will increase cooperation. And I would stop there. And I respected the time frame, right?
You are so respectful.
Thank you.
Amazing. Even though I would love to dive into standards because I'm a boring person, instead we are going to talk about something that is much more interesting. The ambassador mentioned that the Global Gateway is going to help finance instruments. So Enrique as our representative of the European Investment Bank. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Thank you, Berta. I have a presentation with me. Always an image counts more than 1,000 words, so I think it helps to pass the message. First, thanking, of course, the Foundation and the Center for the invitation to be here today. I think the timeline was very well developed. I will put some names and family names and specific examples to the policy conclusions and to the political commitments that were made in the previous session and recently by the ambassador who mentioned the Global Gateway. I will elaborate a bit with a specific examples on the relevance of three main players here, right? So why Brazil first, why Brazil is relevant and why we are all here today. Second, why the European Investment Bank, the institution that I represent here today, and why the relevance of the Global Gateway that the ambassador referred already. So first about who we are, the European Investment Bank. So 4 ideas that I would like to pass on today. First, we are large. We are the largest multilateral financial institution in the world as a borrower and as a lender. We approve yearly around 80 billion euros in a varied set of sectors, and we operate around the world in all countries. So we are large and we make a difference. That's the first idea. The second is that we are the bank of the European Union. The shareholders are the 27 member states, so we are a policy-driven bank. And we are a key implementing agent of the European Union initiatives, as the Global Gateway that I will mention after. The third message is that we are, I was going to say cheap, let's say financially competitive. We are AAA, and we have a policy-driven governance. So we issue bonds in the bank in the world very cheaply, and we pass on that financial advantage to our clients. So that was the third message. And the fourth, and that's why I guess I was invited here, because we are the climate bank. So we have specific goals set by our governing bodies. Half of what we do in the world, it's clean or green, 75 in Latin America, and I, as responsible for the operations in Brazil, 100% of what I do should be green in Brazil. So we have other goals by 2030, reach the threshold of 1 trillion in green financing. So again, the message is that we are green, we are financially competitive, let's say, large, and we are policy-driven by the European Union. The way we operate is basically in terms of clients, and I know there are different representatives here from different sectors, is that I work for public sector. So I work with counterparts that at least they have a 50% shareholding with public bodies. But I have other colleagues in the bank in Luxembourg, which they work with corporates, with private financial institutions, with investment funds. So you name it. We are relatively large and specialized. Another idea is that we, unlike other brothers and sisters working in Brazil, we don't have 300 or 400 employees in Brasilia or in Sao Paulo. So I have one representative in Brasilia, right? I have 400 specialized economists and engineers in Luxembourg, but we are not in the field in Brazil. So we rely on our partnerships with financial intermediaries or with companies to have the capillarity and the impact that we want. So what we do basically, and I will give you some examples of our partners, is we check with those partners that they are able to implement our standards and to have the impact we want. And once we decide they are, so we work through them to have the impact. To give you an example, Sicredi, we had a 200 million euro loan with Sicredi, you know Sicredi, the cooperative, for solar PV. And when they make the allocation, made the allocation request to us, they came up with an Excel file of 76,000 lines with specific sub-projects like solar rooftop, 300 euros, for instance. And we need to approve that. So we work with them. we create these partnerships with the local intermediaries that they know Brazil better than we do, and that's how we reach the impact. A couple of examples. Basically, we work with public development banks, BDMG in Minas Gerais, BRD in Rio Grande do Sul or the extreme south, Banco do Nordeste, a very great project. In microcredit, they had Credi Amigo, if some of you know, for microcredit in the Northeast. We opened with them Credi Amigo para Elas, so for women. That with public development banks. With water and sanitation companies, we are in Minas Gerais with Copasa, in Santa Catarina with Casan, again, private financial institutions with Banco Santander. We have a colleague here today with Solar, Sicredi, BTG Pactual, Banco Votorantim, and then corporates, mainly Neoenergia and Eletropaulo, just to name a few. That those are recent clients that we signed in the last 5 years. So second point, why Brazil? And you see the image here of Porto Alegre, right? We were working with BRD, and they were not able to access the headquarters downtown Porto Alegre for 2 months. It was 2 meters below water. So, and all the rest, you know, you have seen the news. So that's one of the reasons we are in Brazil. So if we want to have an impact in global public goods, mitigation, adaptation, health, you name it, Brazil is the place to be, right? So it's large, and we make a difference worldwide by being in Brazil. That's one reason. Another reason, and Mallory was mentioning before, that Brazil is rich, right? So they have minerales estratégicos, critical raw materials, they have green hydrogen. So even for the European Union interests, and again, we are policy driven, we need to be there if we want to benefit as well and to partner to have access to these resources in a partnership with Brazil. So those 3 reasons that make us being in Brazil. And the third, Berta, the third item is the why Global Gateway. So, and I will go from generic to specifics. Global Gateway is just a political umbrella and a strategy, a commitment by the European Union that in those 8 years we will mobilize around 3 billion euros in investments for connectivity, which will be sustainable and high quality. Then 1 year ago, here in Brussels, there was the EU SLAC Summit, and they came up with a list, actually, together with the partners in the region, of 130 specific investment projects. I will now mention those in Brazil, of course. And that list of projects that was agreed, it was not exhaustive, it's dynamic, it keeps changing, but it sets the tone for the sectors that should be a priority working in these countries. So Brazil, it's very small, but you will see that it's basically the Amazon, sustainable value chains, water and sanitation, renewable energies, obviously including green hydrogen, digital, and ports. It's the mandate we have from the European Union, and it was decided last year together with the Brazilian government, where we should be acting. It's been 2 years close to that. This is the list, not for Brazil, but for Latin America as a whole. Some projects that have been implemented already or close to be fully disbursed in Brazil are considered to be Global Gateway. We discussed Santander before is there. Santander Brazil, 300 million for renewable energy. Sicredi, the example that I mentioned, or one that just recently signed in December with the water sanitation company in Santa Catarina with Casan. It's both public and private. That's an important aspect. Some of the projects there are private. And to conclude, just the pipeline that I'm working on. Basically, I'm working, it's public information, so that's fine, with BNDES, the first operation with them, finally, hopefully the first of many, 300 million in water and sanitation, also with Banco do Brasil, a program for solar PV and lending to SMEs in the Amazon region, 350, and with the Development Bank, one of them, I cannot mention it yet, with critical materials, green hydrogen, and solar PV, and also with another one in the Amazon region. So that's basically, those are the priorities that the European Union together with Brazil set for us, and these are the projects that I'm working in. And again, this is the reason why we are in Brazil, and one important message is that, as I mentioned, we work with local counterparts, and we work together. We don't work alone. And I conclude here, Berta.
Fantastic. I think I've done my job of threatening him too well. Thank you. There were a couple moments when I just wanted to look at you to concentrate on what you were saying, and I saw you nodding like, I'm going, I'm doing it. All right, in that case, we are going to move on, and we are going to hear a little bit about some specific things that we can do for net zero investment. And actually, I realized that the reason I thought you were doing ethanol was because I cannot read my own handwriting. The little note I actually made for you, Joaquim, was, and I don't know if this is true, so this is going to be embarrassing if it's not, is that you originally trained as a naval architect. Is this true?
That is true.
It is true. This is extremely interesting. Unfortunately, we have to talk about investment opportunities. So I'm going to ask you to talk about that instead of naval architecture.
You want me to talk?
Yes, please. Not non-naval architecture, investment opportunities.
Investment opportunity. Okay, would you mind if I go there?
No, of course, please.
Let's see if I can get there. Very good. And I have a presentation. It's there. Fantastic. How I move, I make a little gesture. Brilliant. Okay. So I tried to do the following. In this a few minutes, I will make an overview of Brazilian. Here I presume that people at different level. Many of you know what I'm talking about. Some may look new. But anyway, so the first thing, it's interesting when you think about Brazil, is in terms of fossil emissions. It's quite remarkable that Brazil is in this little corner at the left and at the bottom. So if you look either in terms of per capita or per unit of GDP, Brazil emits less than any other country if you think of the two variables together. So of course, for the very rich country in terms of GDP, in Europe, per unit of GDP, we emit a little bit more because there's a lot of service and so on. But then if you think in per capita, you emit less than Europe. And in regard to the emerging markets, the poor countries, we emit much less in terms of unit of GDP than, say, India or China or Turkey. So it's a quite, say, particular position that we are. And this, of course, relates to what was said before, that our emissions from fossil fuel are just a fraction of total emission, and out of these emissions from fossil fuels, the emissions of industries is even a very small fraction I get there. So you have these, you see that in Brazil, most of the emissions, about 70% or 2/3, are from what is called the use of land use, okay? And this includes both deforestation as well as the way you account for some agriculture activities. Okay, and these, of course, are sorts of conventions. And you see that industry is just 11% of total emissions, okay? Now, in Brazil, you have this quite well measured. We have the inventory and everything. There are a number of institutions. I'm not going to go to this very small detail, but here we could see the main tracks towards net zero. If you just break down the emissions, you see, well, what can you do? Brazil can be a net zero country by 2040. It'll be admirable, but you'll not change anything. Okay, I mean, our colleagues showed the question of the floods in Rio Grande. I think that it shows something that's very important. For many years, people were very worried about what the Amazon could do to the climate. Actually, we have to be more and more worried what the climate can do to the Amazon. The real risk is that global warming, because of emission elsewhere, will really hurt dramatically the Amazon, with impact that will be not only in Brazil, but in the whole South America, and actually all the way to Mexico, because the humidity that the Amazon brings to both South America and Central America will disappear if we weaken the Amazon very much. And it's a big ecosystem, but you know, this ecosystem can be fragile. So I think that more and more Brazil has to think and has to act in international forums, say, okay, we take care of the Amazon, we are reducing our deforestation, but we are really worried about the climate change. What emissions, you know, from all sources are hurting the Amazon. But so if you take out the question of the deforestation, what are the big things? Like was mentioned, transportation. Here, transportation is basically diesel and a bit of gas. Now, diesel may not have a complete solution. Certainly for light vehicles, the hybrid, like President mentioned, Leal mentioned, you have a pretty good solution. A hybrid with the so-called inline vehicle can reduce drastically the consumption because the system efficiency more than double. You get, and a hybrid vehicle can go 40, 45% in terms of efficiency, and actually can also be pretty cheap. So what is the beauty of that is that basically the production of ethanol that you have today, you'll be enough to move a much larger fleet, and with these you can displace gasoline. In the case of trucks and so on, I think he may talk also when he talks about not only ethanol, you're going to have a biomethane, you have other alternatives. So without much effort and maybe without going to a full-fledged electrification with all the costs that involves and the difficulties in terms of battery and so on, we could deal a lot of that. Waste management is moving because people are discovering more and more that you can actually get money by, for instance, getting the biogas from solid waste, and we have a huge transformation now in our water management system, waste systems, and again, you can extract a lot of energy from that. So maybe you cannot get all the 87 million tons, but you get a pretty large proportion of that. Issue and cement, you can talk later. Oil and gas, there's a big effort in reducing fugitive emissions, this global effort for methane. And we have, it's quite remarkable that when you consider both the quality of the oil as well as the process to extract the oil, the Brazilian oil is one of those with the smallest footprint. So when you burn a barrel of oil from Brazil, you have much less emissions than, say, you burn a barrel of oil from Iraq or from many other places, let alone Russia and let alone Canada. Okay, so it's also remarkable that the oil, especially the pre-salt oil, because of its composition as well as the way you extract it, very high pressure because it's very deep, so it involves less production of vapor and so on to the steam to produce it. Is a low emission there. So I think that, and you have to say the chemical industry in Brazil in the last 15 to 20 years has reduced its emission by about 20%. In addition of the possibility of using biomass to some of the process, which is still incipient. Now you have households, well, that's tricky, it's cooking, you can electrify it, but okay, it'll be longer because you have to household by household, and today electric ovens are still much more expensive than use the gas. And then there is livestock. Livestock is quite remarkable what's going on for two reasons. One reason is that productivity keeps increasing, okay, which means that the lifespan to get the beef is much shorter. And because of that, you have less emissions for each pound of beef, okay? The second thing is that by recovering the pastures, actually you are increasing the stock of carbon in the soil. So when you put that, today there are cases where you can get basically a net zero beef. In addition to that, there is more diplomatic issues that has been that, which is the way you compute the emissions of methane. As you know, and ICC has recognized it, is a short-lived gas. So to the extent that you're not producing more methane, is at the same level that the methane you're producing every year, basically by 250, you'll be net zero, okay? Because the methane that you'll be producing net zero, it's just replacing the methane that you have you produce in 2050. It's just replacing the methane that you produce in 2020, okay? And this being very generous because the half-life of methane is much shorter than that. So this is just to get an idea that we could get there on our own terms. And very interestingly, in most of these cases, the new technology will be cheaper, will be more efficient than the older one. So that will require some investment, but actually it's the investment that pays itself. So it may be an issue about financing, but not necessarily a subsidies. And here comes the most interesting thing about Brazil. Like I said, being net zero is admirable, but not very relevant, actually. Now, we can use these advantages, okay, to help other countries to reach their goals, to help the global endeavor. But of course, to get there, we have to really to be serious about what we want to achieve. Of course, discussing climate nowadays is a little bit out of fashion, right? There are other priorities for some countries and security, all these fantastic things, okay? But the reality is that what the difference that Brazil can really make is what we can do with and for other countries. Just before I move there, one of the interesting things that this chart on the left shows is I take the gray area there, the big gray bar in the left, is what is all the emissions that derive from fossil fuels, basically liquid fuels for transportation. And like I said, because you have such a big improvement in the efficiency, moving from 25% of heat efficiency, oh, the neighbor engineer comes, and to move to something to close to 80, it means that actually just because of the amount of energy that Brazil you need, you reduce as you move from internal combustion energy to electric cars. So it's quite interesting that actually it seems that, well, how come you can move from, say, just having half of energy being renewable and another half being fossil? By switching to electricity and electrifying even the hybrid cars, you can do that because the overall energy consumption will drop because of higher efficiency. Now, the question is, can Brazil really produce energy to export in a way or another? I think yes. I mean, we don't have the area with the best insulation in the world. Here I show just Latin America. We all know that maybe in Chile, you may have better insulation. But you have quite a substantial area in Brazil, more than enough to produce 3 times more energy than total energy than you produce now, just with solar. And then, of course, you have also the wind power. And the wind power, we are here talking about 1 tera, more than 1.5 terawatt of potential, okay? And the beauty is that when you combine the solar and the wind, they smooth the production naturally. And if you reorganize the way we do with our hydropower, we can do basically a system, a great system that can produce a very large amount of cheap energy. And here I come to the conclusion. It's the following. Yeah, the following. We have the means to do that, and this can really make a difference at global level, okay? And the prices that are affordable. We can get in Brazil hydrogen at $3 the kilo without much subsidies. But you're only going to get this if you really have a very ambitious agreement with places that might need it. If you don't have an off-taker, we're not going to see this investment. You can have all the money that people say that are ready to lend, but if you do not have access to markets and interest for people to buy that, it'll be very difficult to develop. So I would say the conclusion is from the supply side, and I think it was mentioned before, from the supply side, we're pretty much ready. Okay, if you're talking green steel, maybe there are a few things that you have to learn on how you do the reduction. Okay, with hydrogen, we know to do with natural gas, there's some learning process, but you can do. Again, you can get the hydrogen very, very affordable. The question is, who's going to buy these things? How you can get in a real cooperative approach. And a cooperative approach that looks, first, are you really serious about reducing emissions? You're only going to reduce emissions if you're more efficient. So you have to look at these things in efficient. The good thing when you look at efficiency is that you look also affordability, which reduces the opposition that you see more and more in many places against focus on climate. And you can do this with security because Brazil is a trusted partner. So that's really my message. We can do it, but you need to have the interests of those who can benefit from what you can do. We need this partnership. We need this cooperation. We don't need a lot of, say, concessional finance. We need access to market. So like was mentioned before for one colleague here, you get the benefits of trade. And I stop here.
Thank you. Thank you. Paulo, I think we are going to hear more about what we need from you.
Hopefully, yes. Is it working? No? Okay, thank you. Much better. I'm going to try to make it up, on timing. So don't worry, I'll finish on time. But let me know, just give me a sign. Firstly, I think that some of you noticed that the picture on the panel really doesn't it's not me, but although it seems to be something artificially generated, nevertheless, the picture that you see on the presentation is actually from the Minister of Health in Portugal, who is my namesake. So just for your awareness, it's not really me, although he looks good. So I can't, hopefully I'll look as good as him at his age. So what I'm going to try to speak less about my company and more about the result of good policy making and what it generated in terms of now what we call decarbonization solutions, right? So, and I'm pretty much talking about the policy making of Brazil in terms of the bioeconomy back in the 80s and the 90s and more recently in the 2000s with the Renova Bill. So this is a result of what Brazil has done and what we can present to the world. Very quickly, this is Raizen. It's a pretty young company, only 13 years old, but nevertheless pretty sizable for Brazilian standards. Now we have our net revenue is close to $50 billion a year, and we have about 35 biorefineries and 2 more that we just inaugurated specifically for and exclusively for the second generation ethanol, which I'll be speaking a little bit more in the later slides. But the most relevant thing here is that we are the largest ethanol player in the world, not only by production, but also by commercialization, right? We produce about 8% of the ethanol in the world, but we commercialize over 30% through our trading organization. And this is a little bit, again, You will see from this slide, this is from the International Energy Agency. You see from this slide, and you're probably going to notice that hydrogen is not there, but hydrogen is actually embedded in several sources of energy coming from wind and hydro and ethanol itself. So that's not just reflected in a specific way, but it does show what is the global demand for 2050 and the role of what we call modern renewable energy, which is the definition in the bottom, will have to play to fully reach the mandates and the commitments that have been set by countries and companies themselves. So it is a major achievement that the private sector will have to obtain. And then, of course, I think Professor Simonsen mentioned a few times the potential of sugarcane. That's what I'm really going to be focusing on. And I just wanted to, it was alluded by Professor Simonsen himself, the difference between sugarcane and corn. And you're going to see that the first information on the left, on the top left, you see the yet potential of sugarcane versus corn with, if we apply all the most modern techniques of land use and harvest productivity. There is a twofold increase in the productivity of sugarcane versus a very small increase of corn if we use the same land use techniques. So Brazil, needless to say, is the right place to invest and grow and harvest renewable energy. And on the bottom right, I just want to make it's a comparison on what we can offer in terms of decarbonization solution as a sector, right? Brazil is just an example, but this whole sector actually can offer the same thing. As you can see, the gasoline generates about 100 grams of CO2 per megajoule. And the second generation ethanol on the other spectrum is only 14% or 14 grams. And this is actually improving. This is based on our current production, which is still very small. And this number will be somehow much lower because we're still not using CCS and other techniques that will turn that number in a negative number. And Minister Levy also mentioned a few of these byproducts of the ethanol. And this is a little bit of the how we see how we can help the European Union and, of course, and the whole Europe with their decarbonization efforts. We are currently now on our third wave after producing what we probably know from the juice, sugar, and first generation ethanol, which was the basic byproducts of sugarcane. We moved on to bioelectricity by burning the bagasse of the sugarcane to produce more electricity. Right now, we are producing out of the bagasse, and I'll explain a little bit later on, the second generation ethanol, which is waste-based ethanol and the biogas. And moving on, and we're already getting into the fourth wave, with the same molecule, we can produce sustainable aviation fuel, the e-methanol, bioplastics, and this is actually a major export to Europe, given the chemical industry in Europe, that we are exporting a lot of ethanol to the bioplastic industry, biomethane, lignin, green ammonia, and of course, green hydrogen. Just as a curiosity, we are working on a pilot right now because one of the things that hydrogen, on top of the whole everything that Minister Levine just mentioned on the bottlenecks of increasing hydrogen, another one is how you transport hydrogen. You know, it's a very complicated, it's a very expensive. We don't have the infrastructure Now we are working on a pilot to transport the hydrogen, the molecule of hydrogen within the ethanol, the liquid fuel. So there are more hydrogen molecules in the ethanol than in the air itself. So we can use the current infrastructure of exporting the liquid fuel, the hydrogen within the liquid fuel, which is already existent, and at the destination point, we just need to build the electrolyzer to separate the molecule from the ethanol, which is 1% of the amount of investments that you have to do to build a new infrastructure for liquefaction and then regasification of the hydrogen. Aside from having to transport hydrogen at minus 273 degrees Celsius, which is also a big challenge. The second generation ethanol, and this is our biggest hope for Europe, is a proprietary technology. Currently, Raízen is the only company in the world that are producing second generation ethanol at commercial scale. We just inaugurated our second generation ethanol plant in São Paulo, and this is going to be the second of 20 that we already announced. As I mentioned, is a proprietary technology. We can produce, we're going to increase our output in 50% without having to use one single square meter of land, because we're producing the second generation ethanol out of the bagasse, which is the residue that comes out of the crush of the sugarcane. And this is what the technology is about, to transform the bagasse into more fuels. And of course, given the supply and demand, and especially in Europe, with the commitments that were made about the decarbonization targets, we are able, as of today, to sell our second generation ethanol at a really high premium price. So it is the same molecule. So if you look at chemically, first generation and second generation, whether it's sugarcane, whether it's corn, is exactly the same molecule. So the clients are paying for the sustainability attributes, because as I mentioned, you saw that in the earlier slide, that we are producing at a very low carbon intensity, with very low carbon intensity attributes. So, and this is what the clients are paying for with the carbon intensity. I'm going to skip this one because it's really just a comparison. What I just mentioned, that the top picture is exactly the attributes that the second generation ethanol, really small, you can't see, but it's over 90% of reduction compared to gasoline that we can already deliver to any given client, to any given country. And from that point on, and then I will speak a little bit about sustainable aviation fuel in Europe. It's specifically, sadly, some of you probably know, and Professor Simonson also alluded as well, that crop-based ethanol, which is what we call first generation, whether it's from corn, whether it's from sugarcane, or any other kind of feedstock, it has been vetoed by the European Union to supply both the aviation and the maritime industry. This is basically the reasoning behind this is the pretense competition between fruit versus fuel. The European Union believes that if a product is based on crop, it should be used as food or feed for animals, without really considering the difference in land management and, of course, the harvesting period, which allows, of course, a completely different equation for feedstocks in tropical countries. And I'm including corn in that equation, right? And if you move to sugarcane, you would know that sugarcane at some point you produce 50% sugar, 50% fuel, and if you really don't produce fuel, you're going to throw it away because you can't produce any more sugar, more than around 50% of the supply of the sugarcane. So which means there is no competition between food and fuel when it comes especially to sugarcane. So, but given that, we are presenting a new solution, which is with the second generation ethanol, to be the main supply, the main feedstock for SAF. 100% of our production of second generation ethanol in Brazil is being sold as we speak to Europe, to the European Union. We don't know what the clients are doing with it, but we have a pretty good indication that the clients who are buying the second generation are fully committed to transform the second generation ethanol into sustainable aviation fuel, given the carbon intensity numbers. And Raízen is not only the only, but the first ethanol producer to be acknowledged by CORSIA, which is the methodology that is used by the International Civil Aviation Organization. Last one, and then I promise this is only three. It's this what the premises and the kind of a conclusion of what I just described, that although we do produce one kind of solution, we will need all of them at once. Not 15 years from now, not 20 years from now, right now, all of them. So, and we also believe that science should be the driver for any regulatory decision making, not picking winners or technologies that currently are not working. And we need to kind of go back to the basic and use science as the main driver for decision making. And finally, a full acknowledgement of the real life cycle analysis. I think Ambassador Pedro Miguel just mentioned electric vehicles, and we got nothing against electric vehicles. Actually, we have a business of mobility as well in Brazil. We have charging stations, but we need to be aware that when you measure, the life cycle analysis is when you measure the whole cycle from, in our case, from when you plant the seed all the way to delivering the product at the client. Everything is measured for us. We just want to make sure that every single solution goes through the same treatment. A real life cycle analysis, not from the production on. We want to, in cases of the electric vehicles, that the minerals, that the way the minerals are extracted, the way they are logistically, they go to the manufacturing facilities, and afterwards, what you're going to do with the batteries are accounted for in the life cycle analysis, and then let the consumer make the decision. And that will be it. I do have one more, but I'll skip it because it's just a repetition of this is the bottlenecks. Now, the regulatory, production, marketing, and I just want to make sure one more, and I apologize because I actually took note that Mr. Stefano Soto mentioned that one of the goals for the DG Grow is to kind of find a global CO2 emission solution. The last one, the book and claim, would address exactly that. Is the ability to produce a renewable energy solution in one country and account in another country. That's what book and claim in a simplified way would mean. You find a global CO2 emission solution because climate change has no borders, right? It goes everywhere. Thank you.
Fantastic. You figured out that I have a soft spot for interaction, so you made sure to respond to someone in that last point. And speaking of soft spots for interaction, it is time for interaction with the audience, with the panelists. So if you have a question, please put up your hand. My colleagues will help bring the mic to you. Introduce yourself, although some of you won't need introduction, and ask your question. If you can, direct it to someone, please. Mallory, I will give you this mic. Thank you. And we have our first question over there.
My question is to you, and it's more specific. There is one problem and one opportunity. In Germany, ethanol is made out of barley. Yes. It's a 2-methylic line, and they want to stick to that. That is a problem if you want to follow this plan. The second thing is that people here are not realizing that even if after you squeeze for a second time the bagasse, what is left is a basis for a new plastic industry of degradable plastic. And Rotterdam is the ideal place for this thing to arrive, and develop a whole new chemical industry in all of Lotharingia, using an old name. So, because the Ruhr is a place where you have most of the chemical industry of Europe. So there is a tremendous opportunity for business if the Germans don't stick too much to the metallic line, which is more inefficient than corn, just to say that. So.
There is no. I think this one. I can disagree. It's not. I'm not going to answer. I'm just going to comment on what your comment. Yes, you're absolutely right. There are many feedstocks for ethanol. None of them have proven to be as efficient as sugarcane. But again, I want them. I wish them the best. I want them to succeed. I want all feedstock to succeed. As you saw in the first graph, we need them all. When you need an eightfold in another 30 years, that's not going to be. We're not going to be able to deliver that. Sugarcane, we're not going to be able to deliver that. Even if you add Brazil, US, India, Thailand, and Australia, those are the 5 top countries, we're not going to be able to do that. So bring it on, more. What we can help is with the technology to convert that feedstock into a more sustainable fuel, right? Sadly, so many attempts have been made in Europe, right? A few other companies, and I won't mention them, global multinational companies have attempted to extract the second generation ethanol from barley, from corn, from potato, from beets, and they have all failed. They failed because they don't have enough feedstocks. They fail because they don't have the right technology, and they fail because the feedstocks are not as good as the one that we have in Brazil. So yes, I fully agree. And by the way, we are in Rotterdam. We are doing exactly the same. The byproduct of that nasty liquid that comes out of the second squeeze, as you mentioned, is what produces the biomethane and the green ammonia. And with the green ammonia, we are selling to fertilizers to produce the fertilizer, and then we are buying them back. So we are using, it's fully circular. We are using green fertilizer as well, made with our green ammonia out of the nasty liquid that comes out of the second generation ethanol.
All right, thank you. Cinzia, and then if we have any other questions, also put up your hand.
I have a question for Mr. Levy. So I would like to ask you actually to elaborate from where you stopped. So because you said, if I understand correctly, that so Brazil is ready on the supply side. What is missing now is market access. So I would like to understand where is the obstacle? Is like Europeans don't liking ethanol? Is about transport solution like hydrogen transport, it's what mentioned earlier, is about infrastructure solution. So if you could elaborate a bit on this.
I think it's a combination of that. I mean, we heard about the ethanol and the possibilities. If you think about the hydrogen, one immediate question is, does it make sense again to liquefy the hydrogen, send a ship there, and they'll send another ship with ore to come here and to do a conversion here, to do a steel here, or you make more sense to do the whole process in Brazil, and maybe, well, special steels and so on, there is still a position. So we have to discuss that, see what are the concerns in terms of security, in terms of jobs and so on, and get to something that really makes sense for both sides, for Brazil, for Europe. And I think there's a lot of room, but this is something that has to be negotiated, and I think that might need to be negotiated by governments. Companies can go that far in doing these things. So I believe that you can open a number of possibilities, steel, even fertilizers and other things, as long as the objectives are clear. And like I say, from our side, I think if you give priority to a real reduction of emissions, which usually means to have efficiency, thermal efficiency, and so on. And second, affordability. I mean, we heard about the GG growth and here. But look, who's going to pay for that? And we cannot throw the benefits of trade just because. And I mean, strong countries are countries that have friends. And this goes both ways. So I think we cannot leave that outside in the relationship between Europe and Brazil. And I think also in some cases we have to rethink some approaches. Even the discussion about food versus fuel. I mean, there is plenty of space in Brazil. I didn't show, but I have a map I can show. The area where you have, say, in São Paulo, most of the area that you have sugarcane is recovered from either just pasture, or sometimes you had, say, for instance, orange trees and they had a plague, and you had to replace it, okay? And it'd be very expensive to put that, and you know there's fragile, so they moved to another area. So it was basically empty area. But then, and here comes our friends the diplomats, there are a lot of rules. So even you say, well, for how long this land has been used, when it was first used, and so on. So it's a nightmare, okay, of regulations to very simple activities. So these things require a lot of work, discussions, negotiations, but you have to have the vision, what you want to achieve, okay? And so I could cover a number of things. And I think it's particular, this is particularly flagrant in the discussion of hydrogen. Everybody loves to talk about hydrogen. If you don't have a clear demand for hydrogen, there'll be no project. The finance is there, but who's going to take this risk? So for that, you have to have this type of discussion. And the experiences are usually, if you have a real discussion and you have to negotiate the benefits from one side or the other sides, usually it works and you get things that go for a long time. And this is basically the spirit of trade. So this goes for cars. There are a number of areas that we have to make choices. And these have to be choices that we look at the cost of the efficiency, because otherwise they're not going to happen. The backlash, I mean, every country today is financially, is fiscally stressed. So just to pile up and demand for more subsidies when you have efficient solutions, I think we're going to waste a huge amount of time, and we know that climate doesn't allow us this luxury.
All right, do we have any other questions from the audience? 3, 2, 1. Oh, half hand? No, okay, very good.
On your share of renewables, very interesting. By 2040, I was surprised that your renewables would be that high. Is this global?
That's global, yes. Those are figures from the International Energy Agency.
Wow.
Yeah. But remember, renewables are everything, right?
Yeah, but it remains renewable.
Even nuclear.
But if this is true, the oil prices would be all going down enormously, no?
Okay, then I think I have one concluding question, and after that I will let you all come and talk to the panelists naturally, instead of in this forced format. So my last question is that obviously between the four of you, you cover a huge diversity of topics and expertise. If you could have a fifth panelist to cover some different area, some different view, a little bit of diversity, then what would be the ideal candidate? Or have the organizers done their job perfectly and you, the four of you, cover everything?
Someone from the DG Climate in the European Union.
That's fair enough.
Well, I know it sounds a little bit tricky, but I think that looking at the social impact, both in the south and in the north, is very, very important. We talk about fair transition, has to be fair for everybody, because like I mentioned, otherwise the support may be lacking, there'll be other things. So to put this in this context of how does it impact the welfare of people, both in health, I mean, the issues about flooding and so on and so forth. This I think also gives a very clear and present context to the discussions.
I just came up with an idea. I'm a member of the new parliament, European Parliament, that has influence in these matters.
We would love it if they actually came to CEPS sometimes when we invited them. They're tricky to get. Enrique, would you like to say anything, or are you happy?
No, I'm happy. It's working. Ask the mic, actually, because I was going to complement what Joaquin said. I think that the final beneficiary, as we call it financially, was maybe missing here for that social and very specific touch, but all the rest was perfect. So thank you, congratulations.
All right, we're taking notes. Thank you, everyone. Round of applause for our panelists, please. And I will hand over to the organizers for the wrap-up. Thank you very much.
I'm just here to say thanks to everyone. Firstly, I would like to say that it's a pleasure to be here representing FGV Real Law in this initiative. It is our institutional mission to promote events, partnerships, and research such as this seminar to discuss relevant topics on global and local scale. In line with this mission, we recently created the Research Center in Green Transition. Professor Romulo Sampaio is the coordinator. Secondly, it is essential to mention that this event is a product of the Learning Hub created by FGV Europe and FGV Law. Both units of FGV are committed to promoting the exchange of knowledge between Brazil and the EUI. We extend our gratitude to Professor Carlos Ivan, President of FGV, for his support. Dr. Cesar Campos, thank you for all the support that you give to FGV Law School in its goal of globalization. I cannot go away without saying thanks to Mariana for all the hard work to put this together. Thank you, Dr. Carol Lanu and his entire teams of CEPS. Thank you for being a part in this event. I'm looking forward for next challenge. To conclude, as we know, Brazil is one of the most important investment partners that we heard today. We have a lot of challenges and we have opportunities. I know that the Stone Age did not finish by the lack of stone. We will be able to overcome this challenge, and I think that Europe and Brazil, we can complement each other. Many thanks to all the panelists. Thank you for taking the time to share with us the opportunities, the knowledge, and the challenge that we have. Once again, thank you to everyone who made this event possible. Thank you.
A few concluding words also from my side. First of all, I would like to thank FGV for making this possible. It's really a great pleasure. I mean, I think for CEPS is a super interesting role to play in enhancing dialogue between the EU and Brazil. I think these meetings are so useful to know each other and to build future relations. So I'm really glad, and I hope we can continue on this line. A lot of things were said. It's very difficult to summarize everything. Let me just say one thing. Ties between Brazil and Europe are historically very strong. But I think relationships needs to be cultivated. So you cannot abandon them, or you cannot just pretend that they will continue by themselves. So I think it's a for the European Union, I think it's very important to acknowledge this. And to also acknowledge that Brazil is clearly in a positive spin. This we have learned this in the last days. It is somehow in a very good position when it comes to green transition, because of some choices, because of the wealth of some resources. But this is the reality, and I think it's important that some relations are restored and reinforced. So I would like to close on this very positive note, and I hope that we will continue the discussion. Thank you very much to all of you, to all the audience, all those online and the speakers, and have a good weekend.